David is a regular contributor to the national newspapers and publications including The Guardian, The Times, The Independent, New Statesman and others, and appears regularly on television and radio. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here, and let me begin by paying my deep respects to the original owners of this area. I bring huge solidarity to Aboriginal people, island people from Britain, but also drawing on my own heritage. In the end, I am the descendant of slaves who were brought from the continent of Africa to the Caribbean. So huge solidarity, wonderful to be back in Australia to talk about this very, very important subject. And what I'm going to try and do is bring a global perspective, as well as a UK perspective, obviously, to this very difficult subject. And it occurs to me, and this has not yet really happened, we are still in a place globally where we are tending to discuss these issues in a kind of isolation. There are bits of academic work going on across the world between universities, but it's not yet broken out into a sort of global subject area. And actually there's some confusion globally. If you ask the average person about the country that has the worst problem in the world, the average person would probably say the United States of America. And it's my judgment that's not quite correct. I'll come back to that in a moment. So there's a real need, I think, to break out of our isolated boxes, to join up the themes. And I'm very privileged that a small part of what I did in my review was just the ability, because there were resources, to look a bit globally at what was coming up so that I could reference that into the review that I published. Here's a copy of the review. It is available for free online. You just put in the Lammy review and it will come up in Google, and you can download the recommendations. Now look, I was in a strange position. I am a Labour politician. I am a socialist. And I was asked by a Conservative Prime Minister, David Cameron, to lead a review into the outcomes for black and minority ethnic people in the UK in our criminal justice system. Now I have to say, when I was first rung up by David Cameron in number 10, now about 3-4 years ago, I thought it was some kind of trap. I wasn't even sure I was going to return the call. But I did return the call. I did go for a series of meetings. It was a slightly peculiar moment in British politics when there was, there was a big tent approach by the Conservative government at the time. Sometimes people describe it as compassionate conservatism, reaching across the aisle, drawing people in from other parties. And I established that, I made it clear to him that I was not about to leave the Labour Party. Would this be properly resourced? Would it be properly independent? He gave me those guarantees. And so on that basis, I did this review, and I took the view that it would have been churlish and small-minded of me not to take up the opportunity to explore this issue, which is a major issue in the UK. Just to give you some brief facts about the UK, what we describe as black and minority ethnic people make up about 14% of the UK population and rising. Black and ethnic minority ethnic people make up about 18% of Britain's youth population, which gives you an indication of that rising figure. Obviously largely concentrated in the big cities, in London, in Birmingham, in Manchester, less so in rural areas, but increasingly in suburban areas as people move out of the major cities, particularly for housing. And those populations are historically Black African Caribbean, Black African, and South Indian, either from India, Pakistan or Bangladesh. That's the majority communities. But of course, in my review, which was the most inclusive sense, I wanted a very inclusive sense of what it means to be minority ethnic, it included, for example, a community in Britain that is so often overlooked, frequently overlooked. I think actually a comparable community to Indigenous people here in Australia, and that is our communities of what we would describe as gypsies, Roma and travellers, treated absolutely horrendously in our system, such that there's limited data about their experience. They make up 0.1% of the population, but are 5% of the prison population. And that is an indication of the disproportionality of gypsies, Roma and traveller in our criminal justice system. So my review was as inclusive of different minority groups as it could be. Just to give you the international context for this, and I was able to visit the United States, a country I know very well, to visit Canada, to visit New Zealand, to come here, and also to draw from data in France, by visiting France, and to some extent Spain. My judgment was basically that wherever you are in the world, usually when you visit a prison, you will see the underbelly of the country. You will see minorities in their droves in the prisons, basically. This is a global phenomenon. It brings you to the very basic question of what is offending behaviour and who defines offending behaviour. And of course it's majority cultures that define offending behaviour largely, and it's also right to say that some offending behaviour does require a criminal justice response, but a hell of a lot of offending behaviour requires a public health or a health response. Some offending behaviour requires an educational response. And overwhelmingly, because often you're dealing with minorities, countries can get away with the easy response, and the easy response, on the whole, is a criminal justice response for that problem. I think there's also some questions about who defines what's offending and what isn't offending, who cultivates those laws. My own judgment, I tread very carefully. This is not my country. I've been here now 4 times over the years, studied bits of practice here in Australia. My own judgment is, and drawing on my years of experience as both a lawyer, a politician, and I think someone globally who has a massive interest in issues of race and justice, is it's interesting when you look at some of the figures and the pipeline of who comes into the Australian criminal justice system and how, that Australia is sitting now outside of the global community in its persistence in defining non-payment as fines in some parts of the country as a reason and a pipeline to go into prison and the criminal justice system. Its persistence in picking issues that majority cultures might decide that they don't want, like drinking in public, but effectively criminalise other communities and also see them as a pipeline into the criminal justice system. What was interesting during the course of my review, if I'd been doing my review 10 years ago, the rhetoric of tough on crime would have been very much a global rhetoric. Interestingly, that has changed. Some of you who might think back to the American elections might recall that it was Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton that were being given a hard time about the amount of African American men and women that found themselves in federal prisons as a result of their 3 strikes rule, 3 strikes on drugs and you're in. Basically indicating a slightly different move in the United States, where Republicans now are examining more punitive approaches to criminal justice, really because of huge bloating federal budgets, and because, of course, some of that legislation with a huge heroin and opiate epidemic in the United States, leading to white young men ending up in prison. So the Republicans have changed their minds about incarceration, which has allowed Democrats to move away slightly from the rhetoric of lock 'em all up. Different narratives opening up in the United States. A different narrative opening up in Canada. Obviously Justin Trudeau making some contribution to that. And because David Cameron asked me to do this review, effectively the review I did, and you'll see the way the language is couched slightly different to the way I'm going to talk about it very shortly, it's a cross-party review. So that is a good thing. Globally, there is a moment where perhaps we're taking some of the politics out of this subject, and there's a moment where we can get real and ask some harder questions about criminal justice issues and why they're racialized and what's really going on. Unfortunately, I did not experience in Australia such a move. I did experience in Australia, amongst the politicians that I spoke to in different parties, still very much behind a rhetoric, a reluctance to enter into any election cycle where you aren't articulating a tendency to want to lock people up. And so you get to the figures and how this looks across the world. Now, in the United States, 1 in 35 African American men are incarcerated, compared to 214 white men per population. That's the huge significance of the problem they had in the United States. They, of course, have, people talk about the kind of incarceration complex in the United States, the way they have industrialized prisons. They've got a huge system of private prisons. And of course, you can also see in the United States this huge pattern that just as civil rights begins to kick in between 1968 and the early 70s, this huge soaring prison population. Effectively what the Americans did was they just jailed black men to deal with their problem. And because they have created such an industry, it's very, very hard for them to step back from that huge problem now that has gone on for several generations. So that's the situation in the United States, pretty bleak. Canada next door, Indigenous people making up, similar to Australia, around about 3% of the population, but 25% of the prison population, just under Australia. Generally, Canada's seen as a liberal part of the world, but generally the settlement for Inuit and Indigenous people would be seen as slightly better, well, actually significantly better than they have been for Aboriginal people here in Australia, but still making up 25% of the Canadian system. Just going to a very different country. We don't hear about it a lot because they don't collect the figures in the same way, and this is the French and France. The nature of the French Constitution means that everybody's French. The French don't see race, apparently. But scratch beneath the surface and scratch beneath some of the headlines that you will have seen, go into a French prison And whilst they don't collect the numbers, there are many French prisons where up to 70% of the prison population is Muslim or Arab. That is a serious problem that is being stored up in that system. And I don't want to link it directly with some of the headlines you're seeing coming out of France in relation to terrorism and other things, but you can see that they're storing up a significant issue that they're not even beginning to pick or undress. And they're moving to the UK. 25% of our prison population comes from a black or minority ethnic background. You heard that 14% makes up the national population. Actually, that's skewed because a significant amount of that 25% are black men, particularly, and black men make up just under 3% of the British population. We've got a significant problem, as you have, in our youth justice system, with the latest figures demonstrating that 44% of young people in our youth prisons and youth justice system are coming from a black or minority ethnic background in Britain. So the pipeline story in Britain is set to get significantly worse. That's the context internationally. And the issues are very similar. The issues begin upstream. In all societies, the issues begin long before the criminal justice. The issues begin in the education system. The issues begin in housing and access to housing, particularly in Western economies where being an owner-occupier, having a mortgage, having gone to university and the rest of it is basically the way that the modern system of globalized capitalist economies have been set up. And if you are outside that system, if you're not part of that asset class, if you don't own a home, if you didn't go to university, actually, whatever the colour of your skin, because there are significant outcomes for white working class populations globally as well that aren't so great, you're going to find yourself overrepresented in the criminal justice system. And then, of course, the significance, a huge outlier here in Australia, but significant across the world, the care system. In Britain, we call them looked after young people. I mean, I think that's the biggest oxymoron in the English language. They're very far from looked after. But I think there's a rich discourse in Australia about the damage that institutionalised care does, that the significant problems that it creates that do feel, when you're in, certainly Australia, coming from a different part of the world, it feels that your problems here feel intractable and deeply institutionalised. How does Australia break out of the significant problems that it's got in front of it? There's also a subset issue within this. I dealt with it in my review, and this is women in the criminal justice system. This is particularly pertinent for often for ethnic minority populations, Indigenous peoples, women being so much at the heart of the family. If you put a mother in prison, the outcomes for her children are going to be significant. My own view is, and I've been to prisons all over the world, I've met many women in prison over the years, I'm still yet to meet a woman who is not in prison because of a man. And there are some real issues about why we have female prisons relative to the size of the population in the first place. And I would be of the view that we shouldn't have big institutionalised centres for women. I prefer much smaller residential home type settings and real attempts by the system to keep women, except the most dangerous or pathologically, psychologically damaged women, as close as possible to their families. But that was a real story, and the story that came back to me so often when I looked at the black female prison population in Britain was these women there wasn't a lot of research in this area, there needs to be way more research, by the way, but these women often talked about the way in which they felt deeply stereotyped and problematised when they were in the court setting. That male judge looked at them, and because she did not fit his stereotype in Britain, the joke from these women is he's thinking about his nanny, he's thinking about his cleaner, he's thinking about the woman that serves the food at his children's school, and because I didn't fit that stereotype, he threw the book up and gave me years in prison. So women, I think, is a really, really big theme in this story. Perhaps if we can move women up the agenda globally also, it might be an easier point of empathy for a wider population that doesn't see some of these significant issues. And then we've got the profound problem of youth justice. This is profound because it cuts at the heart to how a society feels about criminal justice, how a society defines offending. And too often, and that was what was so terrifying really about the images that broke open the scandal of detention, juvenile detention in the Northern Territories, a global scar, I think, on Australia's reputation across the world. And that scandal broke just as I was doing my review, and actually I was in Australia at the time. The idea that the age of maturity, accountability can start at 10, again, it's an international outlier. Most countries in the world struggle to understand how Australia could, any province, territory could start at the age of 10. Indeed, in my own review, I raised significant questions around the age of maturity. I like the German system, where there's quite a lot of work that goes into where you can be 18 or 19 and remain in a youth justice setting and not in the adult setting in the German system, because it's deemed that you just haven't got the maturity to sit with adults in their system. And I think there's got to be a lot more reliance on basic child psychology, what we're coming to understand about young people, some of the obvious things. What we know, for example, internationally, when you look at the data, is, you know what? It's unbelievable. Over 3/4 of young people do something criminal whilst they're young. It's what young people do. They make mistakes. They mess up. They break rules. We need to understand that, and we need then to understand why we have outcomes for certain young people and not for others. Let me give you an example from the UK jurisdiction, but I'm sure this is relevant. I'm sure you can perceive this here in Australia. Let's imagine today a white, middle-class, 20-year-old young man. He's at Oxford University, and as we speak here this lunchtime, he's smoking a big, fat joint at Oxford University. It may even be a few yards away. There is a professor in his room also smoking a joint at Oxford University. Guess what? If you called the police, it would almost in our system be deemed as wasting police time. The young man is not going to get arrested. The professor is not going to get arrested. I wouldn't go far as saying it's socially acceptable, but there's an indifference to the context. If you are the same 20-year-old young man, but you're black, and you're in my constituency in London, Tottenham or Brixton, traditionally black areas, and you're walking down the street having a joint, If you are in Harlem, in the United States, or parts of Toronto in Canada, or perhaps, I don't know, in Redfern here, you might start that pipeline to the criminal justice system. That pipeline to stop and search. That pipeline to arrest. That pipeline into a system that's that is the different outcomes for those youth on the same problem. And you can extrapolate that to so many offences. So what is this about? And this is where I've got to be quite clear about where I'm coming from politically, coming from the UK Parliament, but privileged to go around the world on this subject and caring very much about these issues. We tend to talk about racism. Increasingly, those of us who, find ourselves having to talk about the subject a lot, we talk a bit less about racism. Because actually, I don't know if racism quite gets you there. I want to talk about white privilege. I want to talk about white supremacy. I want to talk about one set of rules for one group of people and another set of rules for other groups of people. I want to talk about where this stuff comes from, and this stuff comes from Britain largely, by the way. A few hundred years ago, when the pecking order was set up, and when the system was drawn up, and actually when a lot of our criminal justice system was set up, when a bunch of folk were sent out here, and you'll notice that the Brits have, if you're following the news, you'll see that the Brits have reinvented sending people abroad. They're deporting Caribbean people now back in this Windrush scandal. So what I'm saying is, for me, racism, yes, but actually think about white privilege, think about white supremacy. Now, when we use the word white supremacy, oh my God, KKK, Ku Klux Klan. It's a system on which things are built. It's why in my review, and by the way, the government, I made 35 recommendations in this review. The government, now led by Theresa May, accepted the vast majority of the recommendations. Now, we have to see whether there's a difference between accepting them and implementing them, but they did accept them. I made a big recommendation around the judiciary. Who are our judges? What do our judges look like? Why are we seeing such different sentencing outcomes in our courts for black and ethnic minority? Why are they getting double the sentence? And that comes back to who gets to be a judge. We've now got a lot of ethnic minority lawyers, but they don't find their way up. And I recommended a target. It was rejected. The judiciary rejected it, and I had this endless thing. You can only become a judge on merit. It's got to be on merit. You can't have targets for judges. And I sort of, and obviously it's usually a white, upper middle class man telling me that it has to be on merit. I said, why is it that these white, upper middle class men always believe that they are there on merit and they're not there because of the old boys network? Why does it exclude women, exclude ethnic minorities who are just as good and need to be able to get there? So I put the politics of this on the table because I think that the business of colonialism, of white privilege, issues of race and class are absolutely at the cornerstone of the prison system and the criminal justice system. And it's only by interrogating that you perhaps start to open up a place where we might be able to say, maybe we should go down a health route for this, or a public health route. Maybe this is about well-being. Maybe this is about education. Maybe a social response to dealing with this is going to be better. And let me just, there's so much that I could say, and I haven't really talked about the things that I've recommended because these are common themes. But clearly the pipeline that we have in our system of not guilty, guilty is a disaster for minorities. Forcing young people, young Aboriginal people into are you guilty or not guilty when trust is at the centre of how they perceive the criminal justice is a disaster. and leads to longer sentences, which leads to greater disproportionality. So systems that have stopped that ridiculousness, in my review I called it deferred prosecutions. The New Zealanders are greatly pioneering in this area where they've got this not contested category for their young people particularly. But stopping that system that forces that decision point is very, very important. The other significant area is criminal records and how we deal with the young person who has a criminal record. In Britain, we've got one of the toughest regimes in the world, and it largely means, of course, that once you've been into the criminal justice system, there is no incentive to get out of the criminal justice system because you're never going to get a job. So you stay in the criminal justice system well into your late 20s and early 30s, when all of the evidence is that as people get older, they move away from crime, they settle down, they get a girlfriend, they get a house, they don't want to do crime. And we've got a system that gets them repeating the problem because they can't actually break out of a cycle because their sentence follows them around. But I will end there, and hopefully I can say more over the course of the next couple of days. Thank you.